Welcome everyone to another episode of Kiwi Talks. My guest today is a genius of audio and sound design. He operates the sound studio Exile Sound. He's worked on Call of Duty, Guitar Hero, and of course, Metroid Prime 1 and 2. He is the one and only Clark Wen. How you doing?
Hey Reese, how you doing? Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you for taking time out. I know you're a very busy man, so I'm glad I got you on your day off. So the first question I wanted to ask was just in regards to Metroid Prime as opposed to some of the other stuff you've done in terms of the sound design. So like say with Call of Duty and Guitar Hero, you actually have something to draw from in terms of realistic elements, right? As opposed to Metroid Prime, which is quite science fiction-y. So there's nothing to really draw from that's in reality. So how do you actually decide how you're going to come up with the sound design for that?
So in a game like Prime specifically, I mean,
Well, I suppose we'll start off with just Prime specifically. What was your approach to it?
Yeah, with Prime, I was very much inspired by first of all, Metroid and Super Metroid, and really wanted to keep that sort of lineage of how those games sounded and sort of take that sound and sort of modernize it so that it sounded good for modern audiences. But as far as influences, there are really three things that I was inspired by in that project. And the number one was the movie Apocalypse Now. If you could think of that, the opening scene with the napalm blast. And this is the end from the Doors playing. You hear this helicopter flying by, and it's like this woof woof sound. And for the longest time, I thought that was like a real chopper sound that they used. They just slowed it down, but it's actually a synthesizer that they used. And it blew my mind when I found that out. And it has this sort of ominous, kind of otherworldly quality that fits the surreal narrative of the movie really well. And when I think about Prime, like the idea of using synthesis as a basis of creating sounds to get that kind of otherworldly feel, I think I was very much influenced by movies like Apocalypse Now that did these unorthodox approaches to the audio.
Right.
Another big influence. This is a little embarrassing, but a lot of, if you look at Japanese television at that time, so Japanese science fiction, tokusatsu type stuff, a lot of the sound design in those shows was a big influence. And if you compare that to Western television, where you have like a character who jumps up in the air and flies around, a typical sound designer would cover that with like a wind gust or something like that. But in Japanese shows, they they take a more stylized approach. And they'll break out like the Yamaha DX7 and do like a filter sweep and add some frequency modulation and then add a bunch of crazy delays to it. So you get this really stylized whoosh instead of like your boring wind gust. So that stylized approach to sound design was also a big influence on me on Prime.
Right.
And then third, I think, important element of Prime, probably the most important, I think, is at the time in the late 90s, there was a lot of sort of chest thumping that was going on with game studios at the time. They were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on their audio studios like EA and Interplay, and they were kind of bragging about how they're bringing in these Hollywood sound people to mix their games and bringing this Hollywood sound to their games, as if to say that video game audio was doing it wrong, and we're going to show people how to do it the right way. So, like, I was very much inspired by the idea of taking the road less traveled and trying to don't try to avoid doing what everyone else is doing at the time, and kind of pay homage almost to game audio sounds and using synthesis as an approach. instead of the Hollywood thing that was coming in vogue at the time.
Right. So would you take like a sound effect and manipulate it a lot, or would you play a note on the keyboard and do it that way? What was the way you'd do it?
With Prime specifically, I tried to do as much with synthesizers as I could. So like synthesizers like Absinthe, Metasynth, like Access Virus. Those are like my main synths at the time. And I tried to push that aesthetic as much as I could. And it wasn't until Prime 2 that I started to get away from that and use more real-world sources and try to make those sound as sci-fi as possible and synthesize as possible without actually being synthesized.
Right. I know with the Morph Ball, you thought of an idea of magnets.
Right.
Was that the first thing that came to your mind when you thought of the Morph Ball, or was that something that took a while before you actually came to the idea of using magnets as a inspiration?
Yeah, that was a good example of something that took numerous iterations to get right.
Yeah,
I think first I have like literally 7 or 8 versions of that sound that I did before I came up with the idea of magnets. I think the earliest iterations I was thinking more mechanical, like more mechanical noises, as if the ball was a bunch of little metal plates that were sort of forming together. But it sounded too normal, too ordinary. And I thought when I hit upon the idea of magnets, that I think that tied in with the whole aesthetic of Prime being synthesized. And I could generate sounds and then process them. And with the idea of magnets, so you have this sort of synthetic kind of hum that I sort of sequenced using a sequencer and a bunch of different effects. And when I hit upon that sound and played it for designers, that was what clicked with the team. And I think it fit in well with the rest of the aesthetic of the game, which was, again, using that sort of synthetic tone as the basis for as many of the sounds as we could.
So would you take like the one synth sound and then fatten it, or was there multiple layers to that one sound?
It was a little bit of both. Generally speaking, because if you take a synthesized sound on its own, it's usually pretty recognizable as a synth sound. And if you have really good ears, you can maybe even pick out the synth that I used. So I tried to layer it as much as I could to just introduce some more diversity in the sound sources, so it sounded a little more balanced. So I think the Morph Ball was actually an example of something that's primarily synth-based, but there are some mechanical sounds that are kind of buried in there as well.
Right. And what about with the visors? I mean, because you obviously over Prime 1 and 2, I mean, there's multiple different visors, like the Echo visor, for example, which is obviously pretty much a sound visor. So I don't even know how you come up with the idea of the sound you used.
Yeah, that was the fun one to do because the designer who was in charge of the sound visor, his name was Carl Brown. He was a brilliant designer at Retro. And him and I were both big fans of experimental music. And we used to go to the record store together and just trade stories about cool up-and-coming bands and what CDs to get. So he was very much in tune with sound. And when he came up with the idea, he started showing me early prototypes of what the equalizer was and how it was going to tie into gameplay. So from the very beginning, we were thinking about how sound would play into that. And I just started doing different variations on that sound. I was very much inspired by idea of like a sonar ping, like in a submarine.
Right.
But I wanted to maybe just sci-fi it up a little bit. So that sound was very much synthesized and then processed through numerous effects. And then on the on the GameCube side, we also were very keen on doing some processing on the in-game sounds when you enable the visor. And the only problem was is that on the GameCube, the number of in-game effects were pretty limited. I think you had like a reverb and a really cheap sounding delay. So we actually got a VST plugin and that we liked the sound of. And I think it was from like a French company. So we actually licensed the code from that VST plugin. And we had a brilliant programmer at Retro, Jim Gage, who was able to take that VST code and implement it in our game engine. And we used that to process the sounds of the in-game audio. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the first time that a VST plugin has been used on a console. So that was pretty much how the Echo Visor came about.
I heard that the screw attack was cut from the very first Metroid Prime. So did you design anything at that stage, or did you wait until the second one before you implemented any sound effects?
Yeah, I think we had talked about it at one point, but it was, I think, pretty quickly shut down. So it wasn't until the second game that we actually started designing concepts for that.
Right.
And that was another fun one to do sounds for, because there wasn't really anything in the... I mean, there was if I remember correctly, there's a very simple sound for that in Super Metroid. But like taking that sound and adding, just modernizing it and synthesizing it to sound good was a challenge, but also a lot of fun.
Yeah. So from the minute something is approved to be in the game, do you start working on the sound effect immediately? Or is there a bit of a time delay before that?
Yeah, generally, I mean, it all depends on scheduling.
Yeah. As
much as I could, though, I always wanted to get in early on sound design for an object or for content. Because I have a saying, is like, if you fail, you should fail often and fail early.
Fair enough.
A lot of these very high-level sounds, especially for Samus, like the critical sounds, we'd go through numerous iterations on those. And a lot of times those early experiments were kind of maybe a little embarrassing, or just a part of the exploration and experimentation process. But I think that was also key to just finding out the direction we wanted to go in, and just play testing the hell out of it until it felt right.
Yeah. So what would have been the sound effect that took the longest, that went through the most amount of iterations, you think?
Wow, there were a lot. The space pirates were a good example.
Right.
Because that's such a key component of the history of Metroid.
Of course, yeah.
And I can tell you, like a story is, we went through 3 different versions of the pirates. The first version was based originally on Russian.
Russian?
So I wanted very much to have a language, sort of a recognizable language for the pirates, as opposed to doing just basic guttural grunts. And I had taken Russian in college. So nice. I kind of took Russian and reversed some of the syllables around and sort of developed kind of like a pseudo language for the pirates. So like when they would attack the player, they would have a certain verb that they used. If they became aware of Samus's presence, they would have like an alert kind of phrase that they would use. But then when we recorded it and put it in the game, it sounded like Russian. It sounded like guys yelling some Slavic language. It just didn't work at all. So then I went back to the drawing board. For version number 2, I just had to go with more of a animalistic kind of guttural approach, something that was less recognizable. And I used recordings of a pit bull that my friend had done. And we put that in the game. I remember very distinctly after I put the sounds in the game, we had a meeting with the team. And it was like a weekly team meeting where we play the latest build. And there was the pirate sounds were in this build. And people were basically started laughing at the space pirates because it was so comedic and cartoony sounding. Didn't sound very threatening at all.
Yeah.
And right after that meeting, like my producer, Mike Mann, he said, "Oh, I think you should change the pirate sounds." And I was like, "Yeah, I think you're right." So finally, for version 3, I went back to the idea of having a language for the pirates. And there was a programmer at Retro Studios. His name was Akintunde. He was from, I want to say Nigeria. He'll kill me if I get it wrong, but he was originally from Nigeria, and he spoke Yoruba, which is the language there. It's very exotic sounding language. And so I put him in the booth and had him yell out. We took these phrases in Yoruba and sort of reversed them and played around with the syllables until we came up with this sort of pseudo language for the pirates. And that ended up becoming the basis, the final version for the pirates that everyone liked and pretty much lives on to this day.
Right. So was that then just further refined for Prime 2? That sound effect?
Yeah, that pseudo language that we developed was the basis for Prime 1, 2, and 3.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Now, I know you worked closely with Kenji Yamamoto. What was that experience like? Because from what I understand is the original soundtrack that was pitched was very different. It had like a 70s guitar sort of sound, and then it changed a lot. Is that right?
Yeah, that's cool that you know about that, because it's not a very well-known fact. But the soundtrack for Prime kind of went through different iterations. Originally, like we had contacted the band Attacker to do the soundtrack, and we even used some of their stuff as for one of our demo levels. It would have been amazing, but Nintendo kind of pushed back on that idea for various reasons. But Kenji Yamamoto came on board, and we were all excited about that. And he actually gave us a very early prototype track he did that was meant for the title screen, and it's never been released as far as I know. But it was very different than what we ended up with the final Prime soundtrack. It was very guitar heavy, like a space rock kind of thing, as if.
Oh, really?
As if like Steve Vai met Sun Ra, kind of like this weird, like psychedelic almost, spacey sounding rock thing with like guitars and solos and noodling, and it was very different from what any of us had expected, because we were really thinking more in terms of that original Attacker sound, which is more experimental and more like a darker, more ominous kind of sound. So we sent our notes back to Yamamoto-san, and he was very open to working with us and getting a sound that we were looking for. And that's in the second delivery that he gave to us. I don't remember. I think the second thing that he gave to us was some of the music for the Chozo Ruins. And that was much darker and more in line with what we were thinking. And that ended up being the basis for the rest of the game.
Oh, right. And that was done in the last 3 months or so of development, wasn't it? Correct. The soundtrack.
Yeah, because we actually, after the idea of using Attacker got shot down, Nintendo came back to us and asked if we had any composers that we would consider using as an alternative. So we sent them a list of composers. One of who I remember very distinctly was Bert, who's pretty well known in the remix community. And we sent them a list of composers we thought might work, and then it was months before we heard anything back from them. But they weren't too crazy about our other composers. So it was like 6 months, I think, before we heard back one day from Nintendo asking us if we'd be interested in Yamamoto-san, the original Super Metroid composer. And, of course we said yes. And because how could you say no to that? And
yeah, of course.
That's how the story of how the music for Prime came to be.
So did Kenji Yamamoto do much iterations? Once the sound was found, once you had settled on a sound, would he go through multiple iterations with you? Was there a lot of back and forth? Like, say, you'd take one track, like you talk about the Chaozu Ruins, but did that go through many iterations, or did it kind of stay quite similar to its original inception?
Most of the stuff he delivered, I think this speaks to the brilliance of Yamamoto-san, is that once he knew what we were looking for, the stuff he delivered was almost always on point. It was very rare that I don't think we ever really told him that we didn't like anything that he had delivered. Because I think everything was really, really strong out of the gate. So any revisions that we had gone through would usually just minor, like mix tweaks or maybe adding some additional instrumentation to the tracks. But yeah, the stuff that he delivered and the content in the final product, I think, had very few changes.
Right. And did he send you the music with an idea of where to implement it, or was that solely on you? You'd decide where you're going to implement the music?
Yeah, that was something we labored intensely for months on. It was the placement of the music, and that, I think, speaks a lot to Yamamoto-san, is like how specific he was and how particular he wanted the music to play in Prime. So he would literally give us like a spreadsheet of dozens of music cues and how to play it specifically, down to like literally down to the second.
Wow.
So like after you open the door, wait 2 seconds and then play this music cue. Or when the pirates appear, wait until the last pirate is standing, then play this music cue. So that went through a huge amount of iteration, like months and months, before he was finally happy with the music placement in Prime.
Right, because you have multiple cues for just one scene, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was like some very early usage of like interactive music scoring. So a scene would typically encompass maybe like an intro theme, and then like theme for the battle, and then like a theme post-battle. So yeah, it was a very intense process to get all of that sounding good.
Wow. And I suppose Prime 2 was more of the same, just a refinement of one?
Yeah, that was, I would say by Prime 2, we had our workflow and process pretty much down. So that was much less intense from what I remember. I mean, it was still, Yamamoto-san is very much a perfectionist. So we had to, put in those extra hours to make sure that he was happy. But it was a much less intense experience overall than compared to Prime 1.
I read a story about how the day before you went gold, he made you do some changes up until, 1 a.m. in the morning, was it?
Yeah, literally. And that memory is pretty much burned in my brain, because like I have a lot of those moments in Prime 1 where it was just such an intense process of getting that game out the door. And with that particular day, we were supposed to go gold. And I was expecting to come into work and just do some bug testing and go home at 6 or whatever. And just, I thought we were done. And then I remember getting a phone call at 9 o'clock from Mr. Yamamoto, asking if I can make some changes. And I said, it's kind of late, but sure, I'll do what I can. and he had maybe about a dozen changes he wanted to do, mostly just volume tweaks, but still it was going to take me some time to make the changes and test them because we were so literally hours from going gold. And, went to my producer and had to make sure that he was okay with that. And he kind of shrugged his shoulders, said, okay, go ahead. So I spent literally until 1 o'clock in the morning making all those last minute changes for Yamamoto-san. But I think in the end, that was a good call on his part, just to make sure everything was sounding perfect.
Wow. Considering, I mean, everyone knows well that obviously during the development of Prime, it was pretty intense. I mean, the last 9 months were very, very intense. A lot of 36-hour days, from what I understand. But in your case, because you're dealing with stuff that is so critical in terms of your hearing, because the longer you're doing it, right, your ears get tired. So how are you, one, able to maintain that energy for so long, and then ensure that the quality is not being affected? Because obviously you can't really take breaks, right? Because you're under such a strict deadline.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was very much a sprint to get the game done. I remember there was, the stories are pretty well known, but the last 6 months was pretty much mandatory overtime for the whole team. And we were working 6-7 days a week, 12 hours a day minimum. And, as an audio person, you're right that ear fatigue is a real thing. The way I dealt with it was I would literally take breaks throughout the day. I'd get away from the office and just go back to my apartment and take a nap for like an hour. Just keep my sanity and keep my energy level. Because I wasn't really getting much sleep. And my nickname at the studio was I was the Prince of Sleep Deprivation because I was there so much. So to help combat the ear fatigue and just general malaise in general, I'd go back to my apartment, take a nap for an hour, and go back to work and keep doing it.
Oh my gosh. Wouldn't that mess up your whole cycle as well in terms of your sleeping pattern because of all the different naps and your, the time you're awake versus the time you're asleep is all over the place?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I dealt with that with lots of caffeine and epinephrine and stimulants to keep me awake.
Oh, well, power to you. I can't imagine what that would have been like. Sounds crazy.
Yeah, well, and you have to keep in mind too is that for a lot of us, this was the project of a lifetime, and I was just always a huge fan of Metroid, and being able to work on this project with this team with all my heroes at Nintendo, it was just a rush from beginning to end, and I think that was a big part of what kept me going all those hours.
I mean, because you would have had interaction with Miyamoto, Sakamoto, obviously. What was your experience with both those guys?
It's like working with Yoda, I think, especially when we're working with Miyamoto-san, because he was very sage-like in his wisdom, and he had just like this ability to play through a demo level that we showed him and just key in on all the things that stuck out to him or that he thought could have been better. And it was actually kind of rare that he would comment on audio. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I remember one of the moments that I always remember is at the beginning of the intro level in the hangar. There's like this ambient tone that kind of plays in the background after you land your ship, and this was one of the first things that we had shown to Nintendo as like a first sort of vertical slice of the game, and I wasn't sure if like the ambiences were going to really sell the audio or not. But I remember getting feedback from Miyamoto-san. One of the first things he said in his review was he liked the sound of that ambience in the beginning of the intro level. And when he said that, I knew that I was on the right path and I didn't need to change it. So that became a very key focus, a key direction for the rest of the game.
Oh, wow. And was there much, did you have much to do with Sakamoto? Because obviously he kept probably more of the lore and everything in place, making sure that it kind of fit within the overall narrative, I'd imagine.
Correct. Yeah, it was rare that he would get involved with the audio. I think that was more Tanabe-san and Yamamoto-san. So yeah, Sakamoto-san was more about keeping the Metroid lore and just making sure the game felt in line with the previous series.
Yeah. Because how much of EAD division handled stuff as opposed to retro? Because I know, obviously, voice was part of it. They handled a lot of the voice stuff, and then you just implemented it, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
I think voice was kind of a touchy thing with Nintendo because originally we had done some recordings for Samus's voice, just more of like a temporary kind of placeholder sound, because we really wanted to make sure the impacts when Samus took damage was recognizable in the gameplay. So we got one of the designers to do just some placeholder grunts and screams, just to see how that would feel. And it was never meant as like a final audio pass. But after a few weeks after we got them in the game, we heard feedback from EAD about the voices, about Samus's voice, and they were saying it was too sexual and too sensual sounding. So
okay.
like, they're very, very particular about vocal sounds in general.
Yeah.
So I was happy to let them sort of take the reins on that, and they ended up recording several actresses for Samus's vocals, and we got them back a few months later, and then we ended up picking out the voice we thought worked best, and that was pretty much all my involvement with the vocals for the Prime games.
Because Jennifer Hale was the voice actress, I think, but you used a different actress for the dying effect. Is that right?
Right. Well, we think it's Jennifer Hale. That's one of the things that if I could go back in time and tell my earlier version of myself is, 20 years from now, people are going to be asking you who recorded the voice. I would tell myself, please write it down, like a security box so you don't forget. But like the audio director of Retro, Scott Peterson, and I went back and listened to those recordings. And it sounds to us like Jennifer Hale, and the initials on the recordings were JH. So we think it's Jennifer Hale. So we're 95% sure that was the actress she used. And as far as the death vocal, I ended up going with a different actress because I was very much using the death sound from, I think, Super Metroid as a reference. And I think the version that I ended up choosing, and the version that the whole team liked, had like a higher pitch than the Jennifer Hale version. So that was why we ended up with a different version, so we can match Super Metroid better.
Ah, that's so fascinating. So fascinating. So did you, your time at Retro, how much did that influence your sound design going forward once you left?
I think my Prime, at Retro, I was very much into taking sounds and then mangling them until they were unrecognizable. And that was sort of like my calling card for a long time. But after I left, I ended up at the studio called Neversoft, where we were doing much more real-world based type sounds, like things like for Guitar Hero, or the game Gun, or skateboarding sounds for Tony Hawk. So it was a far, far cry from what we did at Retro. But I think that was also a, a big part of just growing as a sound designer, because I'd never done that type of sound design before, like more just natural kind of real world type of sound effects. And I think making those sounds sound fun and larger than life, I think, is also a skill into and under of itself. So I would say that my career at Retro and my career at Neversoft, and even on games like Call of Duty, um, uh, they're sort of complementary, but I wouldn't say that they were didn't have a direct influence on what I was doing later.
Hmm. You have an interesting analogy in regards to beginners, because you say that beginners make the mistake of focusing too much on implementation as opposed to the actual creative sound design initially. Is that because sound design itself is a lot harder to kind of learn as a skill as opposed to the actual implementation?
Yeah. I think in general, like I can give you an anecdote. Like at Neversoft, we would every summer we would hire interns, and we would get roughly 250 to 300 resumes for a sound intern position, like one intern position. And by and large, what I would see in almost like 85 to 90% of these applicants is that there was a lack of skill level when it came to basic audio engineering kind of skills, things like mixing, things like knowing how to make a sound bigger and bolder, through the use of like EQ and plugins, and things like not even getting into like creative sound design, but like basic engineering principles that I think tend to be underemphasized in a lot of the schools that you see. And those types of skills, like mixing and learning like to have those golden years, takes dozens, if not hundreds of hours. I remember, like, just in my process of becoming a sound designer when I was growing up, I would spend hundreds of hours literally just mixing and making sounds, and that's how I learned to get that creative sound design part of my skill set to sound good. And I think that tends to be lacking in a lot of the up and coming sound designers. So I would say for anyone who's trying to get into the industry, I think probably the biggest investment you can do is to spend as much time as you can focusing on the creative sound design work and the basic engineering principles. And I think that'll put you at the top of the heap when it comes to applying for jobs in the industry.
Right. Given that there's kind of hard to have a template for mixing, right? Because every sound is different. I mean, if you're in the music industry, for example, you can't mix every song the same. Can you find good learnings online? Is there any good things you can suggest online in terms of channels that are good for sound design?
The one I refer to that I got a lot of good content off of is the sound effect blog. The sound effect people who sell the sound library website. They have a lot of really good articles about sound in films and games. That's I find very helpful. There's the podcast from Dave Pensato, who talks a lot about mixing music, but there's a lot of really good content there as far as tricks of the trade, and just how to mix songs in general. Because I think if you can mix a good song, it's still applicable to doing sound design because the basic principles are the same. Because you're dealing with issues like frequency masking and ducking and EQ, compression, all those things. They very much apply towards sound design as well. And I think by and large, the best sound designers that I see who are up and coming are the ones who've done a lot of time mixing. I think that somehow that translates very well into a career in sound design.
Right. I studied audio engineering as well. That's partly why I'm asking about this. But I know one of the teachings that I learned is when I was mixing music is to use multiple speaker systems, right? So like headphones and maybe some terrible speakers and some good speakers. Is it the same principle when you're doing sound design as well? When you're mixing sounds, you're checking them across multiple speaker systems?
Oh, yeah. I think that's pretty critical because you have, especially in today's climate, you have different monitoring, different consumers some who are playing on headphones, some are playing on TV speakers, some are on 5.1 systems. So I'm constantly going back and forth between different playback monitors so I can make sure that things sound good on my big speakers and my small speakers.
I've heard, I'm keen to see if your thoughts on this. If you can make it sound good on terrible speakers, then you're probably on the right track.
Yeah. Good rule of thumb.
Yeah. So how long does that process usually take for you when you're going through the stage of trying to mix everything in terms of a sound effect over multiple speakers?
Yeah, it's usually my rule of thumb is to get it sounding good on my main speakers. Yeah. I use Genelex, but there's a lot of different speakers out there. And then I go through and A/B them on my smaller monitors, which are mix cubes. Generally, it's more a matter of just doing small mix tweaks and EQ to make sure things sound good on the smaller speakers. So maybe I might spend another 15 minutes to half an hour making them sound good on the smaller monitors, but it's usually pretty quick. I think a good sound should just naturally translate well between different speakers, and if it doesn't, usually means that the sound itself is probably not the right approach.
Do you, from a personal preference standpoint, do you prefer going out in the field with a boom and recording sounds, or do you prefer using a keyboard and manipulating sample libraries?
If you asked me that question when I was making Prime, I would very much say that I was more into tweaking and manipulating sounds. But nowadays, I'm also very much into recording as much original source material as I can. So I think especially because there's so many great libraries out there now, and everyone's kind of using the same source. As a sound designer, I think one of the best things you can do is to have like your own unique recordings. The more you can do to stand out and make yourself unique as a sound designer, I think just pays dividends in the final product. And I think it also helps you as far as your career. I think I've seen sound designers who record their own material. They generally tend to do better in the industry as opposed to someone who's just grabbing sounds from libraries that everyone else is using.
Do you use going out in the field to record sounds as kind of a good excuse to go traveling as well?
Yeah, I'm a huge nut when it comes to traveling, and I travel overseas once or twice a year, and I'm always bringing my recording rig with me wherever I go.
That's cool.
So yeah, I have a pretty large library of personal recordings that I've done all over the world, and I very often refer to that when I'm working on games.
I know Tokyo is your favorite city in the world. Is there a particular reason? I've been wanting to go there.
Yeah, Tokyo is an incredible city because it's just it's like if you imagine New York times 1,000, because it's just so vibrant, and lively, and there's an energy there that you can't really find anywhere else. So yeah, I would highly recommend visiting if you ever have a chance.
Is that where you met Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano? Did you meet them in Tokyo, or was it in Kyoto that you met
that's
them?
actually in Kyoto.
Yeah.
Because I was living in Japan at the time, and I had gotten here's the story: is during Prime 1 and Prime 2, even though we had worked really intensely together, Yamamoto-san and I never actually had a chance to meet in person. We'd only talked through video conferencing and email. So when after I moved to Japan, Yamamoto-san kind of reached out to me and sent me an email asking if he wanted to get together.
Oh, that's cool.
So I took the Shinkansen down to Kyoto and met Yamamoto-san and Hamano-san, and that was like a dream come true, because he was very much like a hero to me growing up, someone that I always looked up to. And I told him when I met him, I was like, "This is a dream come true for me." And and then he turned to me and said the same thing. It's like, "This is a dream for me to finally meet you." And hearing that from one of your heroes is like a pretty awesome moment, something that I'll remember. And we ended up, spending quite a bit of time with him when I was there, not just in Kyoto, but all around Japan, and developing a relationship with him. So that was a pretty special thing.
So I imagine you can speak fluent Japanese, like, yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I know not to get in trouble.
Because how many languages could you speak? Because you could obviously speak Russian, Japanese, English.
Chinese is like what I grew up speaking with my parents, so I guess that's my second language.
Of course.
Japanese is my third, and I forgot all my Russian, so I don't even count that anymore.
So, going forward, what do you think in terms of Metroid Prime 4? Do you think what do you think they'll do in regards to the franchise, or what would you like them to do?
Well, I know what I'd like them to do. Whether Nintendo wants to, I guess it's another question. But there's there's a composer. I'm gonna butcher her name. It's Hildur Gudnadottir from Iceland. She's probably best known for the work she did on Chernobyl, the TV miniseries.
Yes.
And that soundtrack blew me away when I heard that, because it's like it blurs the line between music and sound design. It's almost like musique concrète, and where you're watching a scene and you hear this incredible otherworldly soundtrack that kind of blurs in with the sound design of the scene, and the two very much play off of each other. And I thought, like, how cool would it be if Metroid could go back to some of those original roots of from Metroid, the first game with the Hip Tanaka soundtrack, and you did doing like a musique concrète type score that was very experimental, that blurred the line between sound design and music. So like maybe go in a world where the music is all like recordings of like rocks broken down and processed, and maybe even the sound design could maybe even be used as source material for the composer to sort of break down those boundaries between sound design and music. I think that's a very interesting area. It's a very unexplored area in games that I think would fit the Metroid series very well.
Well, I kind of feel like Metroid Prime does that as well, right? I mean, some of the Phazon stuff specifically, you can't really tell if it's sound or if it's music.
Exactly.
Yeah. Was that more Kenji, or did you have a part to play in that and kind of blurring the line?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think when I heard Yamamoto-san's interpretation of the Phazon area in the mines, I definitely wanted to make sure that the sounds of the actual Phazon would sit well with the music. So after Yamamoto-san did his pass on the music, I actually went back to the Phazon sound and tweaked the pitch and just made sure that the two kind of sat well in the mix. So there were definitely moments like that where we went back and forth with the music and the sound design to get them to play nice together and coexist in the same space.
How do you get that balance to sound right, though? So say, like, if you fire a missile and there's a sound effect, and you've got music playing in the background. That music might be catered and it might fit within a particular spectrum of equalization, right? And then like you go into another area and the music's different. So how are you ensuring that, say, the sound effect still passes through the music and it doesn't get all phased out and muddy in the mix?
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's something we are very something that's a big challenge in game mixing, because we can't really predict what's going on at any one time. So we have to rely on systems like ducking or EQ masking to try and get these sounds to sit well in the mix. And it was a particular challenge in games like Prime, because we didn't have those types of systems at the time that we do now. So everything was designed very much piecemeal to sort of coexist in the mix well. So I would have to do things like EQing background sounds to make sure that there was space in the mix for like the weapons. And so it was a very long and labor-intensive process of EQing everything to make sure that things sat well in the mix. And even to this day, like when I listen to Prime, I still feel like it's kind of there's a little bit of muddiness in the mix, which was a result of not having anything like ducking. But at the same time, because there is such a focus on the low mids in the mix, if you listen to it, there's like this kind of like this ominous, dark and sinister tone to that mix, which surprised me after I heard it for the first time in like 15 years. So I mean that sound of all these sounds overlapping and now the frequency masking in Prime, that's, even though it's somewhat of a negative, I think it also contributed to the dark sound of that game.
Yeah, well, it works. Are you able to play any game or listen to any music and not instantly start taking in the audio and critiquing it and being like, "Oh, I would have done this," or "I shouldn't. You shouldn't have done this." Are you able to just embrace it as a listener, or do you automatically go into work mode and start critiquing everything?
Yeah, I automatically go into critique mode. And I literally like have a laptop next to me when I'm playing games and making notes of what I thought worked and what I thought could be better. And it's just like it's like research is what I call it. It's like I want to continually be inspired and growing as a sound designer and just learning from what other games are doing right and wrong. So it's just a natural part of the process for me now. So unfortunately, no, I can't play games just as a casual gamer. But
I know you're a huge lover of film as well, of cinema. Is that the same process? Like you go into a cinema and you listen to it with the massive speakers, and are you able to just sit there and take it in, or are you listening to everything while that's going on?
It's a little better for film, I think. But yeah, it's like I'm always being inspired by all the things around me, especially when it comes to sound design and film and games. So whenever I hear something that sounds really cool in a movie, I'll make a mental note of it and make sure to go back to it when it comes out on video, on Blu-ray, and try to recreate it or use it as a reference for future games.
That's so cool. Have you managed to find any time to play Metroid Dread yet? Is that on the list?
Yes, actually, I have been. I bought it the first day it came out.
Oh, nice.
Being a Metroid fan, so I had to do my duty.
Have you beaten it? Have you critiqued all the sound effects?
It's a pretty hard game.
It is a hard game, eh? Yes, I very much agree.
I just got the Varia suit, so I'm like,
oh, nice.
Just a couple hours in, but I really, the first time I played that game, I'll be honest, I had the knee-jerk reaction. I started critiquing all the things in the game and what I would do differently, and I was like, these guys don't know what they're doing. But then after spending a couple hours with it and finally understanding what they're going for. I think they did a really nice job with the soundtrack in that game and the sound design, and I think it definitely has its unique identity, and it holds up well to the rest of the series. And I think the gameplay in that Metroid Dread is pretty fantastic. So I think they did a great job overall.
It is an amazing game. You've still got a lot to look forward to. But I'll wrap up there. But if anyone wants to keep up to date with what you're doing, where's the best place for them to do that? Where can they follow you?
I am like very much social media agnostic. So I don't really.
Well, that's actually a good thing.
But I'd say probably if you want to reach out, you can find me on LinkedIn. And sometimes I do my best to reply to people who get in touch with me, but sometimes I'm just so busy I don't have the chance to reply to everyone. But I promise I'll do my best to get back to you.
And I also recommend that people check out Exile Sound. You've actually got some good stuff there on your blog as well in terms of resume tips.
Okay.
Some really, really good stuff that I saw, and some audio tips as well. So any sound designers or musicians or any engineers, yeah, I highly recommend that you look at it. But yeah, hey, thanks again, Clark. I very much appreciate it. I know you're insanely busy. And yeah, so I appreciate you taking the time out.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Pleasure talking.
Yeah, likewise. All right, well, that's the show, everyone. Make sure you share, like, and subscribe. And until next time, stay safe.